Good morning and welcome to today's Fridays with Vistage webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some items to help you participate in today's webinar. If you're experiencing technical difficulties joining the webinar session, please dial the GoToWebinar support at 888-259-8414. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. To submit a written question at any time during the event, you may type your question into the questions pane of the control panel and click Send. I would now like to introduce today's moderator, Dave Nelson. Dave, are you there? All right, looks like we might have lost Dave for just a moment, so let's give him a few more seconds to reconnect.
Hey, Dave, back online. It looks like the bridge crashed or something.
Thank you, Dave. It's all yours.
Okay, well, apologies, folks. We just had a major technical snafu. Brian, are you with us? Just checking.
I'm here. Yep. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yep. So let's get rolling. Apologies, folks, for a little glitch there at the beginning. So welcome, members and guests, to the Fridays with Vistage webinar. I'm Dave Nelson, a 14-year member of a Vistage group out of Pittsburgh, CE676, and your Vistage webinar host today. We're talking about engaging your team for operational excellence. Here's a quick stat for you. Research from Dale Carnegie shows that companies with engaged employees outperform those without by a whopping 202%. So there's your why for today. Our guest is Brian Dale, Head of Employee Engagement Research at Amplify. Hey, Brian, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Quick intro, just so everyone knows who's speaking. So Brian leads Amplify's effort in researching and defining employee engagement while building a model of measurement and improvement for his customers. Brian began his career as an analyst delivering executive reporting and analysis at Cha-Cha. After brief stints running his own software startup, he helped design and launch over a half dozen software products in 2 years as a consultant at Developer Town. Brian holds a BA in economics from Wabash College and enjoys spending time with his wife and 2 young boys in his spare time. As we go today, if you've got a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar control panel where it says Q&A, and at the end of the presentation, we'll pick up as many of those as we can. So Brian, let's get rolling. Tell us about engaging your team for operational excellence.
Sounds good. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for everybody being here. You can see the title on the screen. The goal today is to help you see the deep connection between employee engagement and operational excellence. I think they are both dependent on good management, and employee engagement is a fantastic way to unlock operational excellence. I think in a modern economy, you will struggle to have operational excellence if you don't have an engaged workforce. So we're going to review the history of work. There's a lot of changes happening in the work world. I think you're probably aware of that, but we're going to progress all the way back a couple hundred years to where we are today, talk about why there's been such a progression, and how you survive the current revolution that's happening with technology change. And we'll do that by talking about some stories of operational excellence. You may have heard of some of them before, but we'll try to draw out from those stories key things that you should be doing in your business and that are applicable to all businesses. And then we'll take a look at how employee engagement is a key component of that and how you can effectively move forward with key decisions from today. So the first thing is a review of the history of employee engagement. The history of work. Work is changing more rapidly than ever before. I'm going to walk through a couple of things that are evidence of that. We see a massive increase in global wealth. I'll show that going back 2 millennia even. We think innovation is causing us efficiency and a better life for employees. There's some real tangible ways that that's happening. And technology is what's driving this. As an economics student, the one thing you learn in economics is that growth, both financial and economic growth, happens through innovation, and we're definitely seeing that across the world right now. And that's leading to some pretty massive shifts in work expectations and experiences for workers. What workers can demand from the workplace and from their jobs is changing because of that wealth. So just evidence of increasing wealth, you can see, you're probably very familiar with this, but if you go back to the founding of the United States at least, this is the GDP per capita growth since the founding of the United States, and it's obviously significant. You see this in other countries in the world. So this is England going back over about 800 years. You see the same sort of exponential growth in wealth. The entire world, if you go back 2 millennia, you just see this extreme hockey stick of growth in wealth, and really no one is being left out in this. So if you look at emerging economies like China, India, and South Korea, you see the same sort of growth. South Korea is obviously further ahead, but China and India are on the same course that pretty much all of the advanced Western countries have gone through. And then the flip side of this is you see radical declining rates of poverty. So if you look at extreme poverty, it is being eliminated effectively from the world, which is encouraging from a humanitarian standpoint, but it's evidence of a rapidly changing global workforce. We see it in a much smaller level when you think about this is a story from 1889. 8.5 railroad workers died for every 1,000 workers that work in the railroad per year. That's almost 1 in 100 workers that died 100 years ago working the railroad. So when you think about what wealth and what innovation causes, it's not just financial gain. It impacts people's lives in a really substantial way. Obviously, this is not the case today, at least in the United States and developed countries. So you're seeing massive change in wealth, which trickles down into significant personal gain and health improvement for people. So it impacts people's lives. A much more tactical way in which you see technology. I found a really cool story from a report from the Brookings Institute. This chart shows on the left the number of fishermen in India that reported wasted fish at the end of the day. So they would collect fish, they would come into the market, they'd pick a market where they sell their fish, and someone would survey them at the end of the day and ask them, how much did you waste fish today? Were you unable to sell fish when you went to market? What you see on the right of this chart is that waste being totally eliminated after the introduction of a cell phone. The cell phone enabled fishermen to call ahead to the markets and understand where the fish that they had caught was in low supply. So they could go to market, they could get a price that they wanted for it, and they could sell all of the fish that they had caught. So it just demonstrates how a very minor, what we perceive as to be a fairly inconsequential innovation like a cell phone, has significant real-world impact. It lowered prices in this case, and obviously it was better for fishermen so they could sell the goods that they brought to market. So I just wanted to show a very tactical example of this. I think this is what's driving the hockey sticks that you see in the previous charts. Another kind of higher brow or higher level example, what's happening in a more modern economy today, is we're seeing self-driving cars are absolutely taking off. The number on the left is the number of miles that Google's self-driving car drove between 2009 and October of 2016. The number on the right is the number that you see Tesla has driven in the last 3 years. So if we look forward 4, 5, 6 years, I think we're going to be in a world where self-driving cars are a real thing. And I don't know what the fisherman chart looks like in a self-driving car world, but I know there's going to be something, right? There will be businesses that will be radically transformed by the fact that we're not all having to own our own vehicle and travel to work every day. That we will essentially have robots who can travel to work for us. So without being a futurist about it, it's a very tangible thing that is changing our world, and it's impacting the way people live and work every day. And what ends up happening there, so the human impact of that is we essentially move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We move from basic needs, when you talk about railroad workers who are dying on the railroad as they're working, into wealth, which produces the ability to pursue psychological needs and then self-fulfillment needs. I say all of that to just say that this is a good thing. It's a good thing that we all get to experience this. It's a good thing that an increasing number of workers are experiencing this, but it changes what people demand in work, and it changes, and it's also happening because of our understanding of how people best work. So I'm going to talk about how we sort of survive the next wave of innovation. We moved from being a hunter and gatherer economy to an agrarian and agricultural economy, then the Industrial Revolution happened, and we're heading into a sort of a fourth wave of innovation, which is transforming our world again. And companies need to be prepared for that, and they need to think about how to survive that transition, because it'll be much like all the other transitions where many companies and industries did not survive. So we're going to talk about how to survive that, and we're going to do so by talking about some examples. And I'm going to talk about it from a personal perspective. This vehicle that you see there is the vehicle that my wife and I first bought after we got married. It is one of the best vehicles we ever had, and it is a nice, captures a story that happened in the late 80s when General Motors and Toyota decided to form a partnership to build cars together. So in 1984, GM and Toyota partnered to reopen the Fremont plant. They were an odd bedfellows. GM really needed to learn how to build a quality small car. At that time, they were really struggling to build quality vehicles, and with gas prices skyrocketing, they needed to figure out a way to do that. Obviously, Toyota was good at it. Toyota needed to find an American partner to see if their Toyota production system would work with American workers. They were increasingly selling vehicles in the United States, and it was really critical for them to be able to move manufacturing, and they weren't sure if the principles that they had applied in Japan would work with the American worker. So GM and Toyota opened a plant. The plant that they had opened is significant. In 1980, GM had closed the Fremont plant because the employees in the plant were considered the worst workforce in the automobile industry in the United States, according to the UAW. To get a sense for just how bad it was, if you've heard this story, it's fairly famous. Alcohol and drug consumption was common on the job. Gambling was a pretty common break time activity. At the extreme end of things, there was prostitution happening in RVs in the parking lot during mandated UAW breaks. But worst of all, at least from a company perspective, for GM's perspective, workers were actively sabotaging cars. At a juvenile level, you had workers throwing beer bottle caps into the door frame so that when they'd go for a test drive at the dealership, they would rattle and they'd have to be repaired. But that's just the sort of juvenile things. On the extreme end, there are stories about workers who wouldn't tighten the front bolts on suspension for cars. And that's a life-threatening and practically criminal activity that caused significant issues and eventually ended up leading to the shutdown of the plant. So you go from what was one of the best jobs in town for workers there, good pay and good benefits, but terrible outcome for the company, to the point that they shut down the plant. And then Toyota comes in and tries to bring their system to bear. So the partnership was called NUMMI, the New United Motor Manufacturing, Inc., and it's where that Pontiac that I showed you earlier was produced. My wife and I didn't know that when we bought it, of course, but it turns out that it worked out pretty well. Within a year, the same plant with 85% of the same workers from GM as the old plant was producing as many cars of the same quality as the Toyota plants were in Japan. So it was a really significant improvement. I think nobody expected that this was going to be able to happen. But when you look into how it happened, there's some really interesting insights I think are applicable to what you do in your business and to what everybody has to face with workers. And at the end of the day, lean manufacturing is very synonymous with operational excellence. They came out of a very similar methodology, which is the Toyota production system. So when we talk about operational excellence, this is the key test case or use case for how it can improve things for workers. So some of the principles that apply here are really interesting to look at. The biggest one was the attitude amongst the GM production line that you never stop the production line. Whereas at Toyota, the line would stop an average of 3,500 times a day. GM, there was one rule: never stop the line. When they interviewed old workers from the GM plant, there were stories of people having a heart attack and falling into the pit where cars were worked on below the line, and they would wait until the car passed before they'd pull the person out. You never, ever stop the line. But the focus at the Toyota plant was on continuous improvement, and so there was an intentional directive and management to stop the line so that you could improve quality as things came by. The human element that is necessary there is to empower individuals. That's one of the key underlying things that enables the Toyota production system to work, whereas GM felt like you had to never stop the line. GM's attitude towards individuals was that they were cogs in a machine. The goal was to make them as efficient as possible and to never let them apply their intelligence to the process because they weren't intelligent. Whereas the situation in Toyota was pretty much the opposite. So I'll just tell a quick story. There's no slide to reflect this, but one of the most powerful stories from the GM situation was when GM visited a Toyota plant in Japan. There was a worker who had stopped the line and had brought their manager over and requested a tool. They saw this from afar and they could see the worker requesting a new tool and describing what he needed. And as they toured the plant, they came back the next day, and sure enough, the worker had started using a tool, and he was the only one using it. He had a prototype of it. And then by the next day, that tool had been efficient enough and had been improved enough that they rolled it out to all the other workers who were installing that particular part in the car. And it just goes to show the GM workers were stunned. I mean, they'd never seen anything like that. Here's a quote from a GM worker who had experienced a very similar sort of thing. He says, "I can't remember any time in my working life where anybody asked me for my ideas to solve the problem. And they literally want to know. And when I tell them, they listen, and then suddenly they disappear and somebody comes back with the tool that I just described. It's built, and they say, try this." So that just goes to show you just how significant the mentality change was. You go from an employee base at GM who had never been asked to employ their intelligence at work. They were asked to be a piece of the machinery, to come to work and to turn themselves on just like the machines turned on, and to do their job and then go home. Whereas at Toyota, the attitude was that the person closest to the work knew best what to do and that they should be empowered to make improvements. So the first principle that we take away from this that is necessary for operational excellence is to empower individuals. Another example of that, which I'll speak really personally for me, I think you heard in my bio, the last place that I worked was a place called Developer Town. You can see it here. We had a very unique working environment. We had little houses on wheels, as you see in the screen here. So my house is in there somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where it's oriented. And the idea was that we could roll the houses around. There are cords coming down from the ceiling where we could unplug them and roll them together. So if we had a particular team that was working on a project together, we could be close together. We had a private space to work. We could collaborate outside of our houses, as you see here, working on the whiteboards together. And the key thing about that was really helpful for me, which empowered me as an individual, is the ability to focus. There's been a big trend towards open workplaces and the removal of private offices. I'm not going to get into that debate here, but one of the powerful things at Developer Town is the ability to go into your house. You can see there's lights on the outside of them. So flip your light on, and the light meant that you were focusing and not to be bothered, and you could get a lot of work done. You could really focus intently on the kind of work you needed to do. And in a creative environment, that's critical. Being able to design or develop software is a creative act that takes a lot of intense focus. When I moved to Amplify, we had an open working space, which was great. We got to communicate a lot and collaborate amongst the teams, but that ability to focus was lacking. It was really a challenge. And as we headed into employee engagement, we recognized that this was a problem. We needed to empower our team to be able to focus and work really hard. And the leadership here empowered a group of us to make changes to the office that we felt would really help the team be more engaged and operate more efficiently. And without really any approval or guidance, we purchased, prototyped, and rolled out focus lights, which is what we use at Developer Town, but worked in an environment here at Amplify that would work for our decor, that would work to help us focus, and was a really low-cost option. And so you can see we hacked together a little light bulb with a little Edison bulb and a simple drop light, so just a garage light. So it's extremely low cost. Nobody asked any questions. We were totally empowered to do it. It's just a very small example. It's different, obviously, than installing a tool across an entire assembly line. But it's just an example from my own life where we had a management team here that respected this principle and enabled people to work together to improve the work environment. So the next principle that I think is probably the thing that unlocks the ability to operate in an excellent way is that you have to measure the right thing. The key difference in what GM measured and what Toyota measured was that GM was focused on quantity, and they were focused on the number of cars that made it across the line in a given day. whereas Toyota was focused on quality. Everything Toyota did was focused on quality. They knew if they got the quality right, then the production pace would be appropriate and they'd get cars out the door. An example of how this played out is since GM never stopped the line, any defect that was introduced along the line would just make it all the way out the door. And then they disassemble the entire car, fix the defect, and put the entire car back together again. But that disassembly and reassembly made it outside of the measurement. It wasn't a part of that measurement, because if the goal was to get cars out the door, then they got the cars out the door, they hit the goal, and they were done. Whereas Toyota didn't care as much about the pace of what went out the door. They measured quality along the way and directed all of the employees to pay attention to quality. So if there's a problem, you'd stop the line, you'd fix it there, and then you'd figure out why it happened so you could fix it everywhere else. So when we think about how we measure our people, and from an HR perspective, we do a really good job in every other area of the business measuring the right thing. But in HR, we really struggle with this. Measuring people is a very challenging thing. But the principle is still the same. We have to measure the right thing. If we measure the wrong thing, we will probably not get the results that we want. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. So at the end of the day, that Pontiac that you saw earlier was the best car I've ever had in many sense. And I'm kind of a car guy. I've had BMWs, Cadillacs, a number of trucks, a Honda, Volkswagen. Nothing's been as reliable as this car. In fact, it's still in our family. My dad still drives it around, and we're approaching 300,000 miles with it with zero manufacturing problems. So anecdotally, that plant worked, and we experienced the best of it. There were Toyotas and Pontiacs that came off of that plant, and we got lucky to buy one of them. So how do you move forward? I think the question at the end of something like this is how do you act on these things when you've been in an environment that's different than a GM plant or is different than a manufacturing environment? What do you do to move forward? And I think the key thing that we are focused on at Amplify, and that I take away more than anything else, is that you need to be measuring your people in some way that is effective, and that captures the essence of what it means to be a worker that is immersed in their work and is trying to move your company forward. Many companies struggle with this, or they attempt to do it, but they struggle with the same thing that GM did. They measure the wrong thing, or they look at the wrong thing. At Amplify, when we think about the employee engagement space, we think of engagement being the dependent variable. It's the thing that you look at that captures the entirety of that employee experience. But it's pretty critical that it's looking at the right thing. We make distinctions between engagement and satisfaction. We don't and are not interested in trying to measure things that are just behavioral. We don't want to look at things that only assess people's behavior. We want to know where their hearts and minds are. So the way we do that, the way we think about that, the way we think is appropriate to think about that is, at the end of the day, the relationship between the employer and the employee is critical. There are components about an individual that they can bring to the table that are objectively good and bad. If somebody comes to work and they are struggling because of things they bring from home, they don't have enough sleep or not enough energy, that's a bad thing. It's hard for them to bring their best to work every day in that case. Same with the organization. If you have leaders who are overbearing and are unfair with employees, that's an objectively bad thing. It does not help employees. But then there are some things between individuals and organizations that are not objectively good or bad. These are things that we might describe as cultural elements, where there's a fit between people that is necessary. So we try to look at those things. We think that at the end of the day, you have to be cognizant of the things that you believe in, that are necessary amongst your employee base and that you believe are right as organization leaders. But then you also have to recognize the things that are cultural aspects that aren't right or wrong, but are things that you embrace, and you look for people who embrace them as well. And then the layer kind of in the middle there is all the literature around engagement indicates that it's necessary for people to feel meaningfulness, safety, and capacity in their work for them to be able to engage. So we want to assess those things. Those are the critical things to assess in order to properly assess engagement. And at Amplify, we define engagement in a fairly simplistic way, that it's an employee's intellectual and emotional connection with an employer demonstrated by motivation and commitment to positively impacting company vision and goals. And the reason that's significant, and I think it's distinct from many other poor measurements, think the factory line just outputting lots of vehicles, is that we think it is very important that employees are feeling an intensity towards the company and towards their work that helps move the company forward. You can have satisfied employees. In fact, I'd wager that many of those GM employees were satisfied. I don't know that I wouldn't be satisfied if I had a well-paying job that let me drink beer during the day and enjoy my day and then go home knowing that I had a job the next day. So satisfaction falls short in helping your company. So that's why it's important to be very careful about what it is you're measuring. And then when it comes to empowering individuals, which we'll get to in just a second, that's the second key takeaway from what we learned from the GM NUMMI plan, is that it's engagement, while fostered from leadership, is not just a top-down thing. Employees are closest to the human problems in your company. In many cases, they are experiencing those human problems every day. And so at Amplify, we try to bake that into the process that we follow with our customers. On the front end, we measure the right thing. We administer a basic survey. We analyze those results. The survey is constructed to measure what we would consider real engagement, which is a significant psychological construct that we want to go after. And then once we share those results, we follow up, and the follow-up is where we empower employees. The follow-up is intended, much like lean manufacturing, to understand from the people who are closest to the problem what they would do about the problem. What we want to tap into and the magic that we want to unlock is the same thing that happens when an assembly line worker says, hey, I've got an idea on how we can install this part in a more efficient and higher quality way. We want to be there to unlock that so that managers can step in and say, okay, let's try that. Let's try that thing and see if it works. And if it works, we will help you roll it out across the company. The second step in our process is designed to unlock the empowerment of that individual, because they're the ones who know the key problems within your business. And then the last part is about action, right? So at the end of the day, it's still a leader's responsibility to act. It was still up to the manager of that line to make the decision to take that part or take that tool and to broadcast it across other people who are installing that same part on different lines. So our hope is to make the front end of that part easy, to make the process much like lean manufacturing, where there's this consistent attitude of improvement all the time, and then management's responsibility is to step in and make sure that things are actually getting implemented, that change is happening. The ideas for the change, the assessment of where change needs to be made is an automated thing that is constantly running and constantly providing feedback. But management's job is to pick intentionally and intelligently which things should be implemented and helping ensure that they're implemented vigorously and intensely. And we've seen really remarkable results. It's sort of a point of pride for me. One of our Visage customers is a company called TH Marine, and I remember delivering the results to them. This was early on in our days at Amplify, and I was still on a lot of the results calls. It was really, really special because we isolated some pretty serious issues with them on their production team. They had problems with utilization, which just means that workers felt like they could contribute a lot more, but they were being hampered in their ability to create and contribute, and they thought there was more that they could bring to the table. And then professional development, which is kind of related. They just feel like there's more that they can do. They're just not being trained and enabled to do it. And at that time, we didn't have a follow-up process in place, but the company was very smart to involve them in their Kaizen meetings. And took suggestions from them about how to improve the process in the production floor. And what resulted was a simple tool, which was just a lift table that enabled them to reduce physical effort when moving things through the production line and increase productivity from 30% from that one action. And so it just goes to show when you see engaged employees who are presented with the challenge that the business has, and they are genuinely pursued for their ideas on how to improve things, the result ends up being operational excellence. You end up with a process and systems in place that increase production and improve quality across the business. So that's just one example. We have dozens more like that, and I hope that we can help some of you folks do the same thing. It is a pleasure to try to understand the human emotion at work. It is very hard, though. But I do think as you see the trend throughout the last probably 50 years of manufacturing change, and you see it in the software development world, there are dozens of stories in the software development world about being able to get twice the work in half the time The key to all of that is having people who care about your business as much as you do, and that's what we're trying. That's what we're trying to go for here. So if you're interested in learning more, we have a link. You can reach out to us. If you have any questions, we'd absolutely love to hear from you.
All right, fantastic. I'll jump back in, Brian. And folks listening along, if you've got any questions, go to the GoToWebinar control panel. You may need to click the little triangle to make it a drop down as opposed to a sideways arrow, and type your question for us. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, let's take one that came in advance of the webinar. And the question was, great examples from GM, somebody who had reviewed your slides, but how do these principles apply to today's workforce and or smaller companies? So Brian, perhaps you can talk about some other examples, if not specifically by name, clients that you've worked with. And I'll say one thing I thought was very compelling was talking about measuring the right thing. And your example of just raw output versus cars at quality is a good example of a measurement for GM. What would be the corresponding measurements for maybe a typical Vistage member?
Yeah. I mean, I think at a human level, it's measuring engagement. I think engagement has sort of gotten a bad rap, or it's become a buzzword, but it is a serious thing. It's a very real scientific thing, and I think it is I like to talk about it as the culmination of the entire employee experience. People talk often about what drives engagement. We have drivers that we look at, certainly. We have a number of drivers to look at. But I think when it comes to humans at work, employee engagement is the outcome and the kind of the heartbeat of or the pulse, I guess, or the monitor of the overall health of the employee experience. So in the HR space, I'd say it's engagement. And then as for another example of something similar in a more modern environment, we had a knowledge working company, a law firm recently, who asked their employees who were struggling significantly in a particular role what could be done to improve that role. And they got back an overwhelming response about very tactical and tangible ways that they could be involved in the process. So we're talking about a set of legal secretaries who worked day in, day out with the partners in the firm, and they essentially said, give us more work, give us the ability to do some of the things that the legal team does. We have this ability, let us do it, and that will free up the team to have more billable hours and to produce a better output for their clients. So that's just one example. We've seen others. We could rattle off a half a dozen of them, but in a number of different industries, we've seen an example where a particular leader was struggling significantly to lead a sales team, and the evidence was pretty much overwhelming that nothing was going to change in that team without a change in leadership. We had a company make a change in leadership that radically improved the engagement of that team the next quarter and has led to significant performance increases for them. So really, it runs the gamut. I mean, you've got a tool design on one end, you have focus lights here to amplify, you have changing the actual work process within a company at a law firm, and then an actual management change in another environment.
I thought your point about going to right down to the person doing the work to really help understand how to improve it was a compelling one. I'm reminded about a book written by Howard Behar, the COO of Starbucks, who talked about when they were trying to decide, what brooms to buy for the stores. They decided that, well, maybe they should ask the people that sweep the floors. I thought it was just a really great point. Yeah,
and I think a point like that seems so obvious. I think everybody listening would agree that's an obvious thing to do. But somehow when it translates into our work environments, it just doesn't feel so obvious, and we struggle to do that. We struggle to realize that as leaders of companies, we don't necessarily know all of the right answers, and that the people that we've hired, if we've done a good job hiring, are very smart people, and they have a lot of ideas on how to help. Sometimes there's a bit of a barrier you have to get past there. I mean, if trust has been eroded over time, it's hard for people to believe that you genuinely want their input. But if you can get past that, and GM saw this, it took a while. It took quite a while for GM workers to realize that people actually cared about their thoughts. There's a fantastic story out of the GM experience where a GM worker was struggling on the line to assemble a part. And a Japanese executive was walking through the line, touring the plant, and he saw what was happening, and he walked over and told the worker to stop the line. He commanded him to stop the line, and he wouldn't stop the line. He kept saying, "No, I've got it. I'll get it done. I'll get it assembled." And this back and forth happened until, of course, the vehicle had moved past the line, and the line automatically stopped due to the failure. And the response from the executive was that I have failed you miserably. I have failed to inform your managers that stopping the line is your duty, that we are responsible for helping figure out why you were unable to do that. That is not your fault. But it takes moments like that of pretty radical change to help empower employees to believe that they're trusted and that they can contribute.
Yeah, trust clearly is a big part of it. I'm certainly reminded of the old saying that none of us is as smart as all of us. Okay, a bunch of questions coming in. So let's jump on these and knock out as many as we can. So Len was the first one to post. Big issue is how to engage the third shift, the overnight staff members who sometimes feel invisible to the organization. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know the specific environment. I'd be more than willing to dig into it more deeply. But I think if there's a manager involved there, then you need to seek out that manager, even if they're not there during that period. I think in that case, they're the closest contact to those employees, and they will be the ones that are the key conduit to building trust with them and genuinely caring about their input. Secondarily, I would say that you don't have to do engagement assessment or empowering individuals synchronously with when they're at work. Part of the thing that we do with following up with people is asking for their advice after the fact. Here's a problem we see. What would you do about it? Take the broom example, right? You can ask somebody on the third shift about how to improve that environment, but not necessarily when they're working. So when they have free time or are out of work, or out of the normal working hours. So those are two things. Without knowing the environment, it's a little bit challenging. But if there's a manager on site, then that's your key point of contact to make sure that the right principles are being communicated and the environment's being created in such a way that fosters that employee involvement.
Okay, excellent. Let's keep going with some of the questions. Rhett has asked, do you have any suggestions for how to frame company goals to increase the likelihood that employees actually care about them?
That's a good question.
I didn't say these were going to be easy questions, Brian, but I'm
that's a significant one.
At you anyway. Yeah,
no, it's
definitely.
good. I love it. I love that question. It's a great one. One of the things that we believe here at Amplify and that we've experienced, frankly, we moved as a startup a while ago. We were fairly young and had a very different business. And we hired a lot of people who bought into that business, and we sort of moved the goalposts on them. We sold off part of that business, and the meaning and the purpose for those employees was very different. It shifted big time. And so to be totally honest, I think the best way to do that is to have a very clear why behind what you're doing. So goals are a little more tactical. But the fundamental question there is why do those goals exist? So it's a tactical question, why they exist in the near term, but it's a more broad question about why the business exists and what are you trying to accomplish. So be convinced of that and be convicted of that yourself, and then talk to people. And you just have to talk to people. You have to explain that to people. And some people may not buy in. I mean, they may just not want to be a part of it. But we've found, I think, here at our company, and we've seen it with other companies, that just telling people why is the biggest thing. I think as leaders, the hardest part about a vision, mission, whatever you want to, how you want to describe those various components of strategic thinking, is we communicate it, and we think we communicate it well once or twice or maybe even 3 times, or we send an email and we talk about it in person. But it takes, with that kind of communication, it takes dozens of communications over and over and over again to get people on board. If you think about the time that's spent in boardrooms developing that strategic vision and those strategic plans, and then the time that's spent communicating it, it's way out of whack most times. Most times you spend a lot of time planning, a lot of time coming up with it, arguing over it, and crafting the wordsmithing it just right, and then communicate it maybe for 2 months, and then it's gone. So I think underneath everything you do, including goals, there has to be a clear why. And you know, Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, is not a bad place to start here about understanding why that's so important inside the human condition.
I think you've made a really compelling point, too, about the amount of time that we spend developing versus communicating. That's fabulous. I want to go out of order here because I think the last question posted here is going to be very broadly interesting to people. It comes from Robert, who says, how do you measure engagement? So you mentioned a quarterly survey, but what types of things are you asking?
Yeah, sure. So our broad employee survey has, well, let me answer it more generically. I think the right way to measure engagement is through a fairly traditional survey, and I know those words kind of have a scary connotation to them. What I mean by that is in the psychological assessment sense that you need to have psychometrically valid questions, or items in this case, they're statements. Likert items are preferable. A lot of evidence shows that they're the right way to answer or assess these sorts of things. And then you need to get at the underlying construct of engagement, which is a real construct. So in our case, we have 10 items that form an engagement scale. And those items average, they have 3 different dimensions to them, which I spoke about briefly. We think that's the right way. We think that there's a number of people doing this well in the space, but there's a whole lot of people who are not doing it well. You see examples like ENPS, for example, is probably one that's a little squishy, right? It's a little more about satisfaction. If you ask somebody how likely they are to recommend a friend or family member to work at an organization, you can certainly imagine employees at that GM plant saying, yeah, come work here. You know, we can play cards every day and we get to throw our bottle caps in the doors and it's fun, right? You could imagine that scenario. I'm not saying that every employee there was satisfied, but the kinds of questions we ask are things like, I'm proud of the work I do. I can focus intensely on the things that are most important for me to work on. I may not say that one just right, but when I work intensely, or it feels good when I'm working intensely, which captures the essence of intense work towards the benefit of the organization being a good thing in the person's mind, not a bad thing. I think we've all experienced days when we don't want to go home, you know, at the end of the day, right? Or when we wake up, there's a question in somebody's mind, do I want to go to work in the morning or not? That's a good one to get out of engagement, right? If you want to go to work in the morning, you're probably more engaged than if you don't want to go to work in the morning. Whereas satisfaction is more about, what do I take home from work? Am I excited to go home and spend all the money that I made at work? So those sorts of things. And we think a fairly traditional assessment on a consistent basis is the right way to do that.
And just out of curiosity, follow-up, are those usually yes, no sort of binary questions, or like
no,
1 to 5?
Yeah, it's a strongly disagree to strongly agree on a 5-point scale. So strongly disagree, disagree. Okay. Neither disagree nor agree.
Okay, that definitely clarified it. Jeffrey has a question here. As a geographically diverse small company, and there certainly are a number of Vistage members that would fall into this same kind of geographic dispersion. In fact, it seems like a trend these days. How do I, as a CEO with no middle management, balance vision, management, execution related to measurement? And, you know, I'm sort of curious, even though Jeffrey didn't ask this, how much do you think physical presence versus virtual presence for the leader affects the engagement?
Yeah. There's a couple questions in there. There's kind of how do you act as leader in that environment, and then there's how do you measure people in that environment, and then how small is small is the other question. I think we find, so just on a pure kind of statistical standpoint, it gets a little shaky when you get below 30 or 40 employees. We've done assessments that small, but at that point you're pretty much going to want to look at the entire organization as one large group. It's going to be hard to break out and understand groupings very well. But from a management standpoint, how you engage employees in that environment, some group will probably have a lot more face time than another group. And it is just human nature to feel left out if you're not a part of that group that gets the predominant amount of contact. And so I think it's a recognition of the environment, recognizing the challenges, and being very intentional to involve people in what the company is doing, and specifically shared wins in the company. We've seen this in a past product. We saw this a lot where it was really helpful for distributed companies to share in the victories that happened anywhere in the company. It did a number of things. One is it helped bring people closer together because they realized that everyone is contributing. So if you see a success story from some other area of the company, you now relate to them a little bit more. You okay, they do something over there. They're actually contributing. And then when you see yourself being promoted, you feel like you're more part of the company. And so communication is key, and I think sharing in victories together is a pretty key component there.
Excellent. I'm reminded that Microsoft last fall has launched a tool that's particularly good for geographically distributed teams and can be used to share those victories across the organization. It's actually called Teams, the plural of team, and it's a standard part now of the Microsoft Office 365 license. So it's nice to see some technology coming along to help those of us that are in multiple locations. Michelle has sort of a related question. She says, if you were to suggest the top 3 initial implementation steps for us to take to increase employee engagement and experience, what would those steps be?
Yeah, that's a tough question because
it's generic, right?
Well,
generically. So
yeah,
it's give us some examples.
Here, I'll answer the question genuinely because I think I can, in a generic environment, I can answer those. But before I do that, I'd say that's why we measure. I mean, so we're not guessing, right? And obviously, we are a measurement company, so we care about this a lot. But there's some history there. We started out trying to figure out how to improve engagement, and we built an app product for engagement. And we learned, we knew all along the way that to accomplish our mission as a company, we'd have to measure. But we realized that was the key problem, right? It's hard to measure, and that we wanted to tackle that problem wholeheartedly. So that's my real answer. But if you can't measure effectively or can't figure out a way to do that, then I would say don't underestimate what we talked about a minute ago, which is the McKinsey and Company talks about it as meaning quotient. So if you have IQ and EQ, intelligence and emotional quotient, sort of the next wave for humans is meaning, and people derive meaning in a lot of different ways. So it's not a simple thing, but if you want to get the right people on the bus who believe the things you do, then you have to talk about what you believe and why. And it feels odd, I think, for some people to talk about what their company believes, but almost every company has some purpose behind why it existed, why it was formed, what it's trying to accomplish, and it may be it may not be something that's particularly altruistic. That's fine, but just talking about that, explaining why you exist and why they should be a part of that. I like to talk about a progression when it comes to meaning. First, you have to know why you exist. Second, you have to be able to articulate that clearly. Third, people have to know that, so they have to get that communication and at least understand it. Then they have to believe in it. And so if you can progress all the way through those things, I'd say do that. Work your way through that. That gives you a foundation to build on with all the other elements of engagement.
Excellent. Let's keep going. And folks, if you've got a question, by the way, Michelle says, very helpful, great answer. Thank you, Brian. If you've got a question, please type it in the panel where it says questions, and we'll continue to address as many as we can. All right, so an interesting question here from Ryan. After empowering an employee or group of employees to help make decisions or implement a new process, how important is follow-up? I'm guessing you're going to say that's very important, but what does that follow-up look like? Ryan wants to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think it's important. I will say there is no better follow-up than actual change. I think if you look at the key themes across two big movements, lean manufacturing and Scrum software development or modern software development, that's the principle you see, is that the feedback loops are so tight and change happens on such a consistent basis that there's not a lot of follow-up needed in that sense. It just happens. You see it happening. We talk about this internally as a company. What happens if we measure all day long and we help leaders take action and we struggle to move the needle there, right? Or they don't take action, they don't move the needle. We think that there is no substitute for actual changes. If you've empowered somebody, so let's take the focus example, or focus lights example at Amplify. I was a part of implementing that along with another team of people. We sort of disbanded, and there was a little bit of a lag time in doing it, and then I picked the ball back up and implemented that. And they just showed up one day. We talked about it probably 6 months ago at a company meeting that it was coming, and then one Monday morning they're all just there. We didn't need to send an email about it. They were just there. It just happened, right? And there was instructions on how to use them, and that was it. So obviously some changes happen behind the scenes, and they're not a present and obvious change, and you need to communicate well in that case. But I would still go to the default. We focus a little bit too much on how to manage change versus actually changing. I'd say a commitment to real change is the best answer there.
Well, let's just go a little deeper because there was
Sure.
another question regarding the focus lights. In this case, I'm curious, and so many times with new systems, we roll something out, and maybe we even train people so they get it, but the behavior change is usually the hard part. So the focus lights are all there, and we get it. The light's on, I'm in the zone, don't bother me. But how does that really get adopted organization-wide? Because if there are people ignoring it, they're walking in, interrupting. You're not really getting the benefit of the solution you're trying to provide. So the behavior change, how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I know I keep going back to the example with the GM plan, but it is such a good one, and it's the one we've been talking about. So Toyota talked about how they got the American executives to believe. And their attitude was, let's implement the process. The changes will convince you, right? So the outcome will convince you. And I think that's so just anecdotally, that's what happened here at Amplify when we implemented the focus lights. Of course, it came from an experience I had. There were a couple other people who had come from the company that we had been at where we had experienced the houses. And so there was already sort of a seeding of the idea that it was a good thing. But the moment someone flips that light on and they're able to focus for 2 hours and not get disrupted, they believe, right? I mean, when you find changes like that have immediate feedback loop, they sort of they move through the culture naturally. Now, not everything is that way. One thing you mentioned in your question was about interruptions. Essentially, you're dealing with bad actors, right? You're dealing with people who are not respecting the process that's been put in place. And I think there is a role in management there to manage that, to say, look, we put this in place because we think it's a good thing. If you don't think it's a good thing, I need to know why. And if you're still not on board, then we've got a problem. Right? There's a problem here because this is something that we've intentionally implemented to help improve the lives of people at work, and you're not playing by the rules. We talk as a software company. Software development is a team sport. There are a lot of great software developers out there who will not play ball with other developers, and that's a serious problem. There's no better way to hamper a team of developers than one person who won't work well with others. And so that's where management has to manage really well on a one-on-one basis and step in and be very honest. There's a phenomenal new movement and book called Radical Candor, where you express radical and significant feedback into an employee's experience and help them move forward, but you have to do it from a position of them knowing that you care about them. And so there's this combination of a deep personal relationship that you need to have with your employees, but then that opens the door to be very honest with them because they know that you care about them. So I would say that's a one-on-one management thing, and you have to correct the behavior there and manage that.
All right, well, that's a great place to wrap up today. Folks, in case you didn't notice, there is in the GoToWebinar control panel a little area for handouts, and if you click the drop-down triangle there, you should be able to click on the link and get a PDF of the slides. And Chris, I see from the chat that for some reason you can't download the PDF. If anyone has that issue, remember all of the Fridays with Vistage webinar recordings are available usually by the next Wednesday after we do the recording at vistage.com/webinars. So next Wednesday you'll find this recording with the slides on our My Vistage site, again vistage.com/webinars, and there's tons and tons of great recordings from past webinars. So Brian, thanks very much for jumping in and telling some great stories and very directly answering the Q&A as they came in.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And Dave, I added a little bit of richness to those slides and the notes. So just there will be an updated set, I think, that we'll send you for Wednesday. I've got all the links to the books that I've referenced and the stories that were talked about.
Excellent. Fantastic. All right, well, let's bring it to close. I'll remind people that we will be back again in just 1 week. Interesting session at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, on Friday, June 9th. That will be, is your mission statement dying on the wall? Sort of relates to the value question we had today, and that's going to be Jackie Dryden. He'll take us through it. And then 2 weeks after that, Friday, June 23rd, same time, we're going to have a session on a business owner's guide to asset protection and succession planning. So on behalf of Brian Deo and the entire team at Vistage International, I'm Dave Nelson. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you at the next webinar.